Michael had always been a man of routine. The ranch had been in his family for generations, and he had grown up learning every inch of the land, every fence post, and every winding trail that led through the dusty hills. Life on the ranch was hard but honest. Days began before the sun rose and ended long after it set. Horses needed feeding, cattle needed checking, fences needed mending, and the earth demanded constant attention. Michael had accepted that this life, simple as it was, would likely be his whole life. There was comfort in knowing what each day would bring, even if it meant long, lonely hours under the scorching Arizona sun. He enjoyed the quiet of the desert. The wind rustling through the sagebrush, the occasional call of a hawk, and the soft crunch of his boots on dry earth were sounds that grounded him. But even in this peaceful life, there had always been a subtle emptiness. Human connection was rare on the ranch. The closest neighbors lived miles away, and while Michael had friends from town, most of his days were spent alone. He had grown used to it, telling himself that solitude was simply part of who he was. Then came the day that changed everything. It was late afternoon when Michael first noticed her. He had been repairing a broken fence near the edge of the property when a figure appeared in the distance. At first, he thought it was one of the ranch hands, though he hadn't expected anyone. As she drew closer, he realized she was not from the town or any nearby ranch. She was tall, with long dark hair that shimmered even in the fading sunlight. Her posture was straight and confident, yet there was a cautious wariness in the way she moved. Michael instinctively slowed his work, curious but careful not to startle her. The girl stopped a few yards away, her eyes scanning the horizon, as if measuring the distance between herself and him. There was an intensity in her gaze, a mixture of pride and loneliness, that made Michael uneasy in a way he couldn't explain. He wanted to speak, to ask her why she was there, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he nodded politely, giving her space while silently observing. For several days after that, Michael noticed her wandering near the edges of his property. Sometimes she was alone. Other times, she was with a small, sturdy horse that seemed as wary as she was. She moved with a grace and ease that suggested she was used to surviving on her own, and there was a quiet strength about her that made her presence impossible to ignore. Michael could feel a pull, an unspoken invitation to bridge the distance between them, but he wasn't sure how. Finally, one evening, he decided to approach her. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the desert, and the air was still, heavy with the scent of dry earth and sage. Michael walked slowly toward her, keeping his voice low and calm. "Hello," he called softly. "Are you all right? Do you need any help?" The girl froze at the sound of his voice. For a moment, it seemed as though she might run, disappear into the hills like a shadow. But then she looked at him, really looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. Her eyes softened, and in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I've been alone too long." The words hit Michael unexpectedly. They weren't a question, a request, or a complaint. They were a simple, raw truth. He didn't know what to say. He could see the loneliness that had shaped her life, etched into every line of her face, in the way she held herself, and in the careful distance she maintained. She wasn't asking for company or sympathy. She was merely stating a fact, a confession carried across the desert air. He nodded slowly, unsure of how to respond. Words seemed inadequate. Instead, he offered a small gesture, a smile, and a nod of understanding. She didn't step closer, but she didn't retreat either. That brief moment of connection, fragile as it was, felt like the first crack in a wall that had surrounded her for years. Over the next week, Michael found himself looking for her during his chores. Sometimes she would be near the water trough, brushing her horse's mane. Other times, under the shade of a mesquite tree, watching him silently. Each encounter was brief and careful, as though she was testing him, measuring whether he could be trusted. Michael didn't rush her. He understood that trust, especially for someone who had been alone for so long, couldn't be demanded, it had to be earned. He began leaving small offerings, a container of water near where she usually rested, a warm meal placed discreetly under a tree, a blanket left for the cooler nights. At first, she simply observed these gestures without acknowledgement, but gradually, she started accepting them. One evening, she looked up as he approached and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of thanks. Michael felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. As their silent interactions grew, Michael began to notice other details about her. The way her eyes seemed to miss nothing, how she moved with careful precision, and how her hands bore the marks of someone who had worked hard to survive. She was a mystery he wanted to understand, not out of selfish curiosity, but out of genuine concern. He sensed that beneath her proud, solitary exterior, there was a story waiting to be told. Stories of hardship, resilience, and survival. One afternoon, Michael finally found himself speaking more openly. He asked about her family, her life, and how she came to be alone in the hills. She responded cautiously, revealing fragments of her past, a childhood spent with the Apache community, lessons learned from elders, winters spent enduring harsh conditions with only her horse for company. Each word she shared was measured, careful, as if she feared that revealing too much might make her vulnerable. Michael listened without interruption, understanding that the gift of being heard was more valuable than any advice he could give. He realized that these stories, though sometimes painful, were also a testament to her strength. She had survived what most would find impossible, and yet she still stood tall, resilient, and proud. As the days turned into weeks, a quiet companionship developed. It was not spoken of, not defined, but it existed. Michael found himself anticipating her presence, the way he would notice the brush of wind through the trees, and hope that she would appear under the same mesquite shade. She, in turn, began to show subtle signs of trust, allowing him to help with small tasks, sharing brief conversations, and even laughing softly at something he said. The ranch, which had always been a place of solitude, began to feel different. The chores that once felt monotonous now carried a sense of purpose beyond simple survival. Michael realized that this connection, fragile and slow-growing as it was, had filled a part of his life he hadn't realized was empty. He began to understand that human connection was not a weakness, but a strength, a bridge that could make life richer, even in the middle of a vast, lonely desert. And in the quiet moments, when the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink, Michael and the tall Apache girl shared an unspoken understanding. Neither of them had all the answers. Neither of them was fully healed from the loneliness that had shaped their lives. But together, they had begun to take the first steps towards something new. Something neither had expected, but both quietly hoped for a sense of companionship, trust, and the beginning of a life that might not feel quite so solitary anymore. Weeks had passed since Michael and Ayanna first spoke. The initial tension that had existed between them had softened, replaced by a cautious understanding. Each day, their interactions grew a little longer, a little warmer, though neither rushed the process. Michael understood that trust was delicate, especially for someone who had spent so long alone. And Ayanna, despite her tall and confident presence, was learning that it was possible to let someone in without fear. One afternoon, Michael was repairing a fence on the far edge of the ranch when he noticed Ayanna approaching from the trail. Her horse moved slowly beside her, hooves raising small clouds of dust that shimmered in the late sunlight. She walked with her usual quiet confidence, but there was something different today, a small lightness in her steps, as if she felt safer on his land than she had for a long time. "Hi," Michael called gently, leaning on his tool for a moment. "I didn't hear you coming." Ayanna smiled faintly, the kind of smile that seemed to appear only when she was completely alone with her thoughts. "I didn't want to startle you," she said. Her voice carried a soft warmth that made Michael's chest tighten in a way he hadn't expected. He nodded, unsure of what to say. Words were still awkward between them, but that was okay. Silence no longer felt heavy or uncomfortable. It had become a bridge. Together, they moved toward the fence, and Michael began his work while Ayanna watched, occasionally handing him a tool without needing to be asked. Her presence was quiet, steady, and it gave Michael a strange sense of peace he hadn't realized he was missing. As the sun began to dip lower, painting the desert sky in deep reds and oranges, they paused to rest. Michael handed her a canteen, and she took a small sip before handing it back with a nod of thanks. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them and the soft sounds of the desert. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, and distant birds called from the hills. But all Michael could focus on was the girl who had once been so lonely. Ayanna broke the silence first. "I never thought I could feel comfortable around someone," she admitted quietly. Her words were almost a confession, and Michael felt the weight of them. He wanted to respond, but he knew that this was her moment, her choice to open herself. "You don't have to explain anything," he said softly. "I'm glad you're here. That's enough." For the first time, Ayanna allowed herself to truly relax. She leaned back against a tree, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and watched the horizon. "I've been alone for so long. I forgot what it feels like to not have to watch every step, to not have to worry that someone will take advantage of me," she said. Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the vulnerability she rarely showed. Michael stayed quiet, letting her words settle between them. He had never expected to feel protective in this way. But the thought of her alone in the world, facing hardships without anyone to rely on, stirred something deep inside him. "You don't have to be alone anymore," he said simply. "Not here." Her eyes met his, searching, hesitant. But there was a spark of hope in them that hadn't been there before. She nodded slowly, as if trying to convince herself that it was true. "I want to believe that," she whispered. The days continued in this gentle rhythm. Michael would work on the ranch, and Ayanna would find ways to be near him, helping with chores, bringing fresh water for the animals, or simply sitting nearby while he repaired fences. Each moment was small, almost mundane, but the shared presence built a quiet connection neither could ignore. She began to laugh softly at things Michael said, and he noticed that her laughter was like sunlight cutting through the dusty air, warm and comforting. One evening, after the sun had set and the first stars began to twinkle in the clear desert sky, Michael and Ayanna sat by a small fire. The flames flickered, casting dancing shadows across their faces, and the air was cool with the coming night. Michael had brought a blanket, and they shared it quietly, letting the warmth settle around them. "I never thought I'd sit by a fire with someone," Ayanna said softly. "Not like this, not without fear." Michael smiled. "Sometimes it takes time to learn that not everyone wants to hurt you. Sometimes it takes meeting the right person." Ayanna's eyes softened. "Maybe you're that person," she said, almost to herself. Her voice was low, vulnerable, but it carried a weight that made Michael's heart beat faster. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the desert night, the rustling leaves, the distant call of an owl, the crackle of the fire, and in that silence, a deeper understanding grew between them. It wasn't rushed or forced. It was slow, deliberate, and real. Michael felt the walls Ayanna had built around herself slowly coming down, brick by brick, revealing the strength and warmth that had been hidden beneath years of solitude. In the following days, their bond continued to deepen. Michael taught her small things about ranch life she had never experienced: how to check cattle for illness, how to mend a fence with the right tension, how to guide a horse without fear. She learned quickly, but Michael realized that the lessons went both ways. She taught him patience, resilience, and the importance of quiet observation. He began to notice things he had never seen before, the subtle changes in the sky, the way the wind shifted before a storm, the beauty in simple details he had always overlooked. One afternoon, they were repairing a broken water trough together. Ayanna lifted the heavy boards with surprising strength, and Michael couldn't help but admire her. "You're strong," he said, half in awe. She shrugged, a small smile playing at her lips. "I had to be," she replied simply. "Alone teaches you strength, in ways nothing else can." Michael nodded, understanding more than she knew. He had always believed in the value of hard work and independence, but there was a different kind of strength in surviving loneliness, in trusting yourself when no one else can be there. And now, he realized, there was also strength in letting someone in, allowing connection, allowing trust, allowing life to be shared. Evenings became their favorite time of day. They would sit by the fire, sharing stories of their pasts, hopes, and fears. Ayanna spoke of her childhood in the hills, the long winters spent alone, and the lessons her elders had taught her about courage and survival. Michael shared memories of growing up on the ranch, the challenges of running the land, and the quiet satisfaction of a life lived honestly. Through these exchanges, they began to understand each other, not just as companions, but as equals, each carrying the weight of their experiences with quiet dignity. One night, as they watched the stars emerge across the darkening sky, Ayanna spoke words that surprised Michael. "I never thought I'd trust anyone again," she said softly. "But I think I can trust you." Michael felt a warmth in his chest, a mixture of relief and hope. He reached out gently, letting his hand brush against hers. She didn't pull away. The contact was small, almost insignificant in other circumstances. But for them, it was monumental. A silent promise of companionship, trust, and the beginning of something neither had expected, but both quietly desired. From that moment, life on the ranch felt different. The chores that once felt lonely now carried a shared purpose. Even the long, hot days of work became bearable, because they were shared. And as Michael watched Ayanna move gracefully through the ranch, helping where she could, laughing when something amused her, he realized that loneliness was no longer a permanent part of their lives. They didn't need grand gestures or dramatic confessions. Their bond was built in small, meaningful moments, the quiet sharing of a fire, the passing of a tool, the simple act of watching the sun set together. And in those moments, they found something neither had expected: a sense of home. Not in a place, but in each other. For Ayanna, it was the first time she felt that life could be more than survival. For Michael, it was the first time he felt that companionship could bring new meaning to even the most ordinary days. Together, they had begun to write a new chapter, one filled with trust, understanding, and the quiet promise of a future where they would no longer be alone. And as the desert night wrapped around them, silent and vast, Michael and Ayanna knew that while life would still have its challenges, they had discovered something far greater than the hardships of the world: a connection that could weather any storm, a trust that could heal old loneliness, and the quiet joy of knowing that together they were no longer alone.